Hi friends, and welcome back to No Book Left Behind. I'm your host Mark, and today it's my favourite 12 vintage sci-fi paperbacks, part 1. So today we're here to talk science fiction, and my fairly unusual relationship with literary science fiction, to be exact. Now, this began in the 1970s when I was growing up, and I think it's worth talking a little bit about the era and to explain why I gravitated towards science fiction and why that until about the age of 20 it was the only thing I would read. I was determined that I was going to read science fiction for the rest of my life, and then I stopped, and we'll get into that at the right time. But first, why did I gravitate towards science fiction in the first place? Well, that really comes down to growing up in Great Britain in the 1970s. Now, a lot of people, blinded by nostalgia, will talk about the 1970s and other eras as the good old days. Well, I would beg to differ in the case of the 1970s. I had a happy childhood, but it was rather despite when I grew up, not because of it. Because to me, the 1970s can be best summed up by the idea of me sitting in a cold school mobile classroom, staring out at rain falling out of a grey sky and puddling on a concrete grey car park while a teacher droned on about the repeal of the Corn Laws or something of that nature. That was my experience of the 1970s. It was grimy, and in a simple word, it was naff. You see, even television was grey back then. We didn't have a colour set in my family home until probably the early 1980s. But it wasn't just the monochrome nature of our equipment that I'm talking about here. Because back then there were only 3 television channels in Great Britain. And one of those you could pretty much discount. That was BBC Two, because certainly in the average household that was seen as a bit too highbrow for general viewing. It did change as the 80s went on and competition came in from the newly birthed Channel 4, for instance. But at that time it was something we rarely watched in my house, apart from on a Friday night when they showed the glorious exception of the horror double bill, when you got one of those wonderful old black and white Universal monster movies first, followed by a Hammer movie, which I was never allowed to stay up and watch because they were on far too late, and obviously they were far too gory and nasty for a child of my tender years. But yes, that was pretty much the extent of television that was available. And also, it seems rather bizarre to talk about it now, but TV was not on 24 hours a day. It closed down around midnight. There was a curfew. And what would happen is when you got to the end of the regular programming, you would have a 5-minute discussion program about a religious subject, usually called something like The Big Question or Thought for the Day or something. And then they would play the national anthem and the screen would go to static. And it would stay that way until probably about 8 or 9 o'clock the following morning. And even during the week, you'd even get a close down in the afternoons on the BBC. It would close at about 2 o'clock after a magazine programme which followed the news, and not come on again until the kids got home from school at about sort of 4:30ish. And the only good kids drama tended to be on ITV actually, rather than the BBC. And it was there that you got some vaguely science fiction type orientated shows, maybe a little bit of spookiness. But their existence really owed themselves to one thing, and that was the only bright point of television in the 1970s for a kid growing up, and that was Saturday tea time on BBC One, where of course you got Doctor Who. Now, I grew up watching Doctor Who and I absolutely loved it. I did not spend lots of time cowering behind the sofa when the Daleks came on, apparently, although I was spooked a little bit by the Ice Warriors, according to my mother. But yes, it was a fantastic show and I enjoyed it a lot. But here's the thing. This was before the days of recorded media. So It was way pre-streaming, obviously, but it was also pre any kind of discs, or even a decade before VHS videotape arrived and changed the whole ballgame. So if you wanted to watch a show, you had to be there, actually sitting in front of the telly when it was broadcast. And in this particular case that I'm about to relate, in the early 1970s, that was not a very fortunate thing, because back then, roughly in 72, we had a problem with a winter of discontent in the UK, where there was lots of industrial action. And that meant you always had to have your box full of candles close at hand, because we used to get random power cuts. There was no warning when they were going to happen. There was no information about how long they would last. The power would just go out and come back on some time in the future. You didn't know when. And this happened during the last 10 minutes of the final episode of the Doctor Who story, Curse of Peladon. And yeah, I was mad about that. I really was. Because that was it. You know, BBC had a reputation, and still does, I think, in older people's minds, as being a station that shows endless repeats. But for some reason, they very rarely reran Doctor Who. And I didn't see the end of that Curse of Peladon adventure probably for about another 15 to 20 years. As crazy as that sounds now. But one of the ways, and the only way you could relive those Doctor Who exploits, was through the novelizations of the show. And yes, finally, after this rambling intro, I've got back to books. Because, yeah, they brought out, I think in the end, over 150 classic Who novels. And I think about 50 of them were published in the 1970s when I was reading them. Because that's how I started reading. That was my introduction to it. And I think between my older brother and myself, I think we had about 30 of those paperbacks, something like that. But that was the way that I got into reading. That was what kicked it off for me. Now, as time went by and we got towards the end of the decade, my interest in that show began to wane a little bit. And that was because I was getting older. That's one obvious factor, and more critical as a result. And also the fact that me and my brother, during one glorious week in 1977, got to see both Star Wars and Close Encounters of the Third Kind on the big screen. And obviously after that, Doctor Who looked a little bit diminished, shall we say. And indeed, the quality of the programme, I think, really did deteriorate after my Doctor, John Pertwee, left and we got Tom Baker. Now, that's not to decry Tom Baker's performance in any sense. He was very good in the role. And I did enjoy the first couple of seasons with him as the Doctor very much. But I'm afraid the production standard, well, the standard of it, all of it, started really to go down the toilet in the late 70s, in my humble opinion at least. So at that point, when I was about 12 or 13 years of age, I was looking for a different literary experience. I wanted to read some more science fiction, but not necessarily Doctor Who anymore. And that's where we get to the point of talking about my dozen favourite vintage science fiction paperbacks, which all date from this period between the ages of about 12 to 13 and about 19 or 20 when I purchased them. Because after all these years, I still have these paperbacks with me and I'm going to share them with you. So let's get into the dozen paperbacks, starting with, obviously, number one. So this first one has a very special place in my heart, because back in those days, and we're talking 1977 here, this was way before the internet. So the only way you could find out about books and authors was literally to go down the bookshop and look through the shelves and read the blurbs on the back of the books, and maybe look at that list of other published titles that was in there. That was it. That was pretty much your only way of finding anything out, unless you were buying certain magazines, which I believe were being published at the time, but I didn't know anything about that. I was just somebody who was living in a fairly small village outside a fairly small city in rural England. So yeah, we didn't really have much connection to anything else. And that Christmas in 1977, I just asked for some paperbacks, some science fiction paperbacks. I don't think I even made the choices. I think it was just, that was it. I just asked for some random books. But whatever, one of them I received was this one. And this is Wanderers of Time by John Wyndham. And this is the one that really kicked it off for me, because I can still recall the breathless excitement I felt reading the title story. Because that's a novella. There's 4 other short stories here, all of which I enjoyed, but it was Wanderers of Time that did it for me. And this was about a scientist who invents a time machine to go back and find his girlfriend because she disappears. And he gets 10 years in the past to do that, but the machine is damaged, and on the return journey, it ends up millennia in the future when the world is very different and is being run by machines which are operated by insects, I believe, if memory serves. And I think they run across some other time travellers who have been stranded there as well. Now, this was terrific to me. This just blew me away completely, and it started me off on my long reading journey in earnest. And I was so impressed with this that I immediately, I started to save my pocket money together so I could buy anything else that I could find by this guy. And to start with, I bought books like Stowaway to Mars, Sleepers of Mars. I think there was another one called Exiles on Asperus, I seem to remember. And, The Secret People, mustn't forget that one. That was his debut. But I didn't know at the time, of course, those were his pre-World War II novels, and were separate from what he did after the war, which was very different. And that brings us to my next selection, and we're really going to get into the gold standard of John Wyndham's work there. And so my second choice, somewhat inevitably, is The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham. Now, this is the story of Bill Mason, a man who goes into hospital for an eye operation and misses an unexpected global shower of meteorites, which pretty much the rest of the world watches. Unfortunately, the light from the meteorites renders everyone blind, and civilization begins to collapse very quickly indeed. And also man is replaced at the top of the food chain by an aggressive plant species called the Triffids, and Bill has to navigate his way through this difficult new world to try and find some other survivors, and hopefully just to try and rebuild some kind of civilization from what's been lost. Now, this is a terrific novel and an acknowledged classic, and one that really struck home to me because it changed my perception of reading, in the sense that this is the first novel I ever read that was told in the first person, and that gave it a vivid quality and an immediacy that's never really been beaten for me. It's still, after all these years, my preferred point of view in a novel, although a third-person narration isn't a deal-breaker by any means. Now, it's been filmed several times, and I think probably most successfully by the BBC. I think that was in the early 80s. It was hampered quite a great deal by a lack of budget, pretty obviously, but it's still probably the best retelling we've had. It's certainly a lot better than the 1963 Hollywood movie with Howard Keel, which took some real terrible liberties with the original story, particularly with the origin of the Triffids, which in the book is quite complicated and deliberately vague, but in the movie is caused by the advent of the meteorites. They spread spores which kind of bring this obscure plant species to aggressive life. And yeah, that's kind of too simple really, and a little bit on the naff side. Even worse, it's revealed that the fatal weakness of the Triffids is seawater, which I think is just so juvenile as to be not really worth mentioning almost. But yeah, those two things, as well as the extremely dodgy special effects, which have dated extraordinarily badly, make that 1963 movie rather, a bit of a naff experience these days. But still, ignore that and go straight to the novel, because the novel is a classic. It's one of my absolute favourites, even after all these years. Now, as I've already said, it was very much pot luck finding the right book in the 1970s. There wasn't a lot of information out there. You literally just had to go to the bookshop, pick the books up, read the blurbs on the back, and select what you thought sounded the most interesting. And I was very fortunate, I think, to pick some of the books I'm showing you today. Unfortunately, there were plenty of occasions where I picked things that I didn't like, unfortunately. But we're here talking about the good stuff. And my next selection is The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. Now, this is the story of a future where everyone is telepathic, but some people are more telepathic than others. And the ones that have got high skills tend to work for organisations like the police. And this has made murder a virtual impossibility. But there's one man out there who isn't afraid to try it and see if he can get away with it. Now, this setup obviously echoes some of the work done by Philip K. Dick much later, specifically his novella The Minority Report, which was of course very famously turned into a movie by Steven Spielberg. But this is a book that is a rattling good read, an entertaining thriller from beginning to end, and also has a murder mystery component that really appealed to me. Now, there's no political slant to any of this surveillance here. This may feel a little naive to a modern day reader, I think, who would expect some more of those kind of implications to a society where authority has the ability to read people's minds. But I still think it's a great book. I still love it, and I really, really want to read it again. But I'm not going to say that probably about all these to a sense, because preparing for this video, that's one thing that struck me very hard. The fact is that I do want to give these another go and see what I think of them now. And my fourth selection is Gateway by Frederik Pohl, which was published in 1977 and won multiple awards. Now, this story concerns the Heechee, an alien race who are long gone by the time humanity encounters what they've left behind. And this technology mostly features a huge hollowed out asteroid, which we call Gateway, but also includes a fleet of spaceships. Now, their operation is somewhat of a mystery, and they have pre-programmed destinations which can't be changed. Fortunately, conditions back on Earth are pretty ropey, so there are plenty of volunteers who are prepared to crew these ships and take them to these unknown destinations, not knowing how long they'll be gone, or even if they'll be able to make it back alive. And the story features one such desperate man, Robinette Broadhead, who wins a lottery back on Earth which gives him just enough money for a one-way ticket to Gateway and a shot at one of these incredibly dangerous voyages. Now, I love the world building here. It's terrific. The concept, everything is just so immersive, and Pohl gives us so much detail about this world, including lots about the Gateway Corporation, who all these volunteer pilots are contracted to work for, and whose business practices reminded me somewhat of the much-loved Weyland-Yutani Corporation that you may have heard of. Now, it's worth mentioning, however, that there is a series of these Gateway books. They're only loosely connected from what I can gather, because I stalled on the sequel, Beyond the Blue Event Horizon, which is a direct sequel to Gateway. But yeah, I was underwhelmed by that one and never got around to the rest of them. And I think that's a crying shame. And as I've said already, this video is inspiring me to reread some of these books. So when I do, and I'm going to try Gateway definitely, I'm pretty much sure that I'm going to be buying the rest in the series as well. And my next choice is the wonderfully bonkers Hothouse by British science fiction author Brian Aldiss, which I think was published originally in 1962. Now, this is the story of a far future Earth which has stopped rotating. The sun's got hotter and turned the surface into this huge tropical jungle, which pretty much originates from one massive banyan tree. And we follow a tribesman called Gren, who enters a symbiotic relationship with a fungus. and ends up travelling to the moon, which is now in a fixed orbit with Earth and linked by these cobwebs spun by these strange but huge spider-like plants. So I've never been into science, I've never been a scientist in any way at all, and even I knew as a teenager that this concept, this world is utterly ridiculous, completely silly, but my God, it's so much fun. And I think if you just ignore all that, and if you just accept that this is fantastical fiction, just strap in for the ride, you'll have a great time. And this led me to read lots of Aldiss's other work. He was incredibly prolific though, so there are as many that I never did get around to, but I never found anything as remotely enjoyable as Hothouse, with possibly the exception of the Heliconia trilogy, although the middle book of that is incredibly bloated, and I had a lot of problems getting through it at the age of what would have been probably too young for it. But yes, Hothouse is certainly a recommendation from me if you like your science fiction pretty wild and outlandish. And my final selection today is City by Clifford D. Simak, which was originally published in 1951. Now, this is a collection of 8 tales, 8 fireside tales, told by talking dogs who are debating the eternal question, is humanity a myth or did it actually exist? Because yes, this is the far, far future where the human race has died out and the robots have left to explore the universe, and the world has been left under the control of the ants and the talking dogs. Now, this cycle of stories begins with the cities beginning to be abandoned and people going to live in rural communities to practice farming. Now, as the stories progress and the centuries pass, this downsizing of civilization, if you like, becomes more than a trend until at the end of it, we're left with people being extremely isolated. And this is reflected in the stories here about early days of space exploration when pioneers are often working alone. And eventually the human race just seems to die out through sheer loneliness. It's a unique concept, very original, and probably seemed incredibly quaint even a decade later when you reached the 1960s and concerns of overpopulation became a thing. But now, as of today, where we've got a global birth rate that is absolutely falling through the floor to such an extent where the projections are that the population of the planet will be about half its current size by the end of the century, maybe Simak had some kind of a point. Anyway, these stories are amazingly engaging. I particularly love the idea of the dogs sitting around telling them. That's superb. And I just fell in love with this book, and it led me to try a lot of his other books as well, although I never found anything that made quite such an impact. Although I would particularly recommend Way Station. I thought that one was a lot of fun. And I did remember enjoying one called Catface quite a lot. But that's it for today's first 6 selections in my favourite dozen science fiction novels. Now, a part 2 will be following, of course, and in that one we'll get into the reason why at the age of 20 I pretty much abandoned literary science fiction for good, although I have remained absolutely faithful in terms of watching all the major movies that have come out since. I don't think I've missed one up until about 2021. I'm a little bit behind, I'm afraid. I did watch The Matrix Resurrections the other day, which was a waste of a couple of hours, wasn't it? Anyway, that's it for today's video. Thank you for staying with me right the way until the end. It's much appreciated. Please don't forget to hit that like button if you've enjoyed it, and consider subscribing. Why not? You can always unsubscribe if you want. So, have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Did you like my recommendations? Or any other modern science fiction novels you'd like me to try? I'm not averse to giving science fiction another go, even after all these years. And we'll get into that, as I say, in the second video. But just for now, all I can say is, please don't forget to keep roaming through those narrow side streets in your town to try and find those strange dusty bookshops and seeking out those market stalls, those car boot sales, those charity shops, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Be seeing you.